Hey everyone, Wolf Lord Rho here. Today we're discussing the nature of the Orks, how the Imperium may be better served, revealing the truth of the Xenos. Spoiler warning to begin, as the events we're discussing today are from the short story Iron Inferno by author C L Werner. As always, I really recommend you read the stories for yourself first, as that's the best way to enjoy the lore for yourself, without spoilers. But with that said, let's just jump straight in. Now, to us fans of the lore, the nature of the Orks is something iconic, embedded into the very nature of the 40k universe. If there's not a war going on somewhere, it's just not 40k. But while we may be used to the Imperium going up against the Xeno threat, the reality is knowledge of the Greenskins is suppressed as much as any other knowledge within the Imperium. Okay, not the same as Chaos, but they certainly don't go out of their way to teach the people the truth of what's out there. If it's something you don't need to know, you don't. If your world's not important enough, you don't. In the vast expanse of the Imperium, the truth is more spend your lives oblivious to the dangers than knowing of them. And the question is this right? Is this the best way for the Imperium to operate? An age-old debate of ignorance is bliss versus knowledge is power. And it's the short story Iron Inferno that really highlights this question for me. Now, this is a pretty old story, but one that absolutely brought a smile to my face, proving that once a good story, always a good story. Now, it takes place upon the imperial world of Izanagi, capital world of the Yamato system. Certainly not an imperial world to rival the likes of Armageddon, Necromunda or Macragge in prominence, but it is developed enough to have its own standing planetary defense force. Once the jewel of the system, Izanagi has now become a world gripped by fear. It begun with an asteroid emerging from the warp at the edge of the system, cataclysmically on course for the world. Nothing could be done. The end of Izanagi seemed nigh. And indeed the impact was immense, rocking the planet entire. Its repercussions caused a fallout winter, blocking out the sun with ash. However, despite the devastation, Izanagi survived. Unbeknownst to the people of the Yamato system, it was no mere asteroid that had collided with their world, but an Ork rock. And it hadn't crashed, but landed. Well, at least as the Orks would describe it. With the fallout blocking all form of global communication and surveillance, it unfortunately took too long before the danger in their midst was realised. Expeditions sent to inspect the crater were lost, and soon in an ever-increasing wave, settlements around the impact began to fall. Now, perhaps on a more favourably located system, or at least a more important one, the possibility of this being an Ork assault would have been known from the beginning. However, Izanagi knew nothing of the Greenskins, or at least very little. Sure, they know to hate the Xeno. Aside from worshipping the God Emperor, it's the very foundation of the Imperium. But just what those Xenos are in any real detail, well, I guess that perhaps isn't as important. Interestingly, we get to see a PDF general's first impression of laying eyes on an Ork, this one dead and laying on an autopsy slab. As a military commander, he's been blessed enough to see pictures of them before, even read a few reports, but it's clear he still has absolutely no idea what he's up against. To call it manlike would have been sardonic and insulting to the grace of human physiology. It was a squat, four-limbed beast, its limbs swollen with grotesque masses of muscle, its ugly skull jutting out from its broad shoulders on the merest stump of a neck. Its skin was like old leather, green where it had not been blackened by the plasma guns of the Skitarii. Huge fangs jutted from its lantern jaw. Beady red eyes glared from either side of its ape-like nose. There didn't seem to be room for a spoonful of brains in its thick, sloped skull. Yet the Ork had been carrying a bulky, ramshackle weapon that had the tech priests scratching their shaven plates in confusion. This, then, was the enemy. It seems almost incredulous a commander of an Imperial force can be so unprepared for what he faces. Yeah, sure, he's only the commander of a planetary defense force. On the grand scale of the Imperium, pretty insignificant. Even looked down upon by the standing regiments of the Astra Militarum. However, to the people of his world, to the people of the Yamato system, I dare say there's not much more an important role. The problem with the Imperium is its vastness. It's simply too big. It has more worlds teeming with human life than even the Vaults of Terror accurately know. And so there's simply no adequate system in place to convey enough information to everyone. It takes years, decades, centuries to convey messages from one side of the galaxy to another. And so the Imperium exists on its corest principles, the most basic of tenets that any man or woman or child can understand. Praise the God Emperor, burn the heretic, kill the Xeno. They don't need to be educated. They don't need to have documentation or instruction. They are embedded, instinctive, passed down through the generations for 10,000 years. And it's hard to argue it hasn't worked. However, as is the case for the world of Izanagi, sometimes it's just not enough. How many worlds have fallen amid the dark because they simply wasn't prepared? They didn't understand what they were up against. The Orks' advance gained speed and brutality. As more settlements fell, a clearer picture of the situation could be found. The enemy were making a beeline for the nearest hive, no pun intended. The PDF had been pushed back, but now they felt for certain they had the upper hand. The general had his plan. Through a 70-kilometer stretch of valley, the PDF had deployed every mine, every bomb they could. It was nothing short of an absolute kill zone. With no way out once they entered, the Orks would advance into the valley and be annihilated by the devastation. Then, the PDF would spring from their cover either side of the valley hills and wipe out any Xenos that survived in a crossfire. Sounds like a pretty good ambush to me. There was just one key for the general's plan to work. The valley wasn't the only way towards the hive. There was actually a fairly open plain. So in order to convince the Orks to take the seemingly undefended valley, the PDF had constructed a fortress, a mighty bastion of defense. They'd surrounded it with miles of trenches, barbed wire, minefields, hundreds of heavy weapon emplacements, and manned it with countless regiments. It was nothing short of formidable, unbreakable. It would be madness to even contemplate assaulting it. Yeah, I think you can see how that worked out. There was two problems the PDF faced. The first was that a lot of these defences were fake. Cannons were in reality pipes made to look that way. Minefields were just solitary lines at the front. Most of the fortress's walls weren't even real. and the countless thousands of regiments were just a few rotating made-up regiment badges. But hey, it certainly looked the part. And that brings us on to problem 2, the real problem. The general's fundamental lack of understanding of the enemy he faced. For the Orks indeed came, in their thousands upon thousands, but it wasn't towards the undefended valley. Instead, the Orks had advanced directly upon the fortress. Despite every appearance that it was here, the general had concentrated his forces. Instead, or because, the sickening thought made his knees turn to jelly. The horrified general sank into a campaign chair, his head sinking against his chest. The Orks were not human. It had been idiocy for him to expect the Xenos to act like men. They had bought his deception. They did think the Mesa was where he had concentrated his forces, but instead of scaring them off, the imagined strength of the position had drawn them in. The Orks, spoiling for a real fight after weeks of ransacking isolated settlements, hadn't tried to avoid the fortress. They had come straight on. This general's logic had been sound. For any other enemy, his plan most likely would have worked flawlessly against any rational enemy. But he faced Orks, a mind truly alien. The Orks want to fight. They need that fight. Rather than lure the Orks into an ambush, they gave them a free path straight to the hive. The more forces you pile up, the more defenses you add, the more the Orks are going to come. How many unknown generals or commanders make the same mistake, simply because they don't know who they face? How many untold worlds have been lost to the greenskins? Is there truly blissful ignorance? Is the Imperium better off for not knowing the dangers it faces? It certainly would be terrifying to know exactly what is out there. And so you can understand why perhaps a lot of knowledge is intentionally suppressed, or at least not communicated. Let's put the ruinous powers aside. Would the Imperium be a far safer place if every world knew the possible Xeno threats? If every planetary defense force had a general who knew what he faced, who would be able to better prepare his defenses? How many worlds would be spared from a greenskin invasion, snuffing out the threat before it even had begun? Or would a wider, truer understanding of Ork nature perhaps cause more harm than good? Knowing that out there in their teeming billions exists a race evolved for war, a race whose very existence is only to fight, who can't be scared, who can't be intimidated, who the more you fight the more they come, who are bigger, stronger, and able to take punishment like losing a limb without even realizing it, and who, if they could just unite, could overwhelm the galaxy in a tide of green. Well, when you put it that way, I think the Imperium might have a point. But as always everyone, what do you think? Is the Imperium right or wrong to not spread this knowledge of the Xenos? Should more of the average citizens know exactly what threats they face? Should they know of the Orks before they've even laid eyes on one? Would it make them better prepared in case of that emergency? Or is that blissful ignorance the right way to go? That if they truly knew all the threats that were out there, such as the greenskins, then they would simply live their lives in overwhelming fear. More than they already do. As always, leave your thoughts in the comments below, I love to read them. Huge thank you to all my subscribers, your support truly means a lot to me, it really does. If you're new, please consider subscribing to help the channel grow. And if you enjoyed this particular vid, then why not drop a like on it too. With that said, I am off, and I'll see you all again real soon.